Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect with you. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond to the questions you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to all who registered. And we are live streaming this on our Facebook Live page as well. All resources that you see shared as links in the chat will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants, and materials will be made accessible on GLR's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, aka CLIP. Please take 30 seconds to create a free account if you haven't done so that you will not miss the bios, slides, and other materials from today's session. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Lastly, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. On June 1st and June 8th, we have a two-part series that will reprise CGLR's contribution to Education Week's recent leadership symposium with sessions titled Accelerating Equitable Learning Recovery Post-COVID, A Few Big Bets. We will view recordings of various sections from the symposium and engage in conversation with the leaders from organizations representing the big bets promoted by CGLR, including National Board Certified Teachers, Learning Happens Everywhere, which is a growing movement to transform communities into learning-rich environments, as well as EdTech-enabled teaching and learning and kindergarten to college savings accounts. Also on June 8th at 12:30, we will have a Crucible of Practice session at 12:30 Eastern Time, featuring Dalton Whitfield County in Georgia. Then on June 15th, we will hear from district leaders and superintendents about what they most need to learn from early educators about their success strategies for young learners that may be applied in K-3 classrooms. We'll be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for these upcoming learning opportunities. Joining you now is Jeimee Estrada-Miller, Senior Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Well, welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Teachers Respond, What the Data Imply About the Fall 2021 K-3 Classroom Composition. My name is Jeimee Estrada. I'm a Senior Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. I'm currently a researcher and educator at the higher ed level as a lecturer at the University of Southern California, but my roots are really in K-12. I focus my career in education, organizing, policy leadership, and how systems and practices support educating all students and addressing opportunity gaps for low-income kids of color. Today's exchange of ideas continues our Learning Loss Recovery Challenge series and is a follow-up to a session co-sponsored with Education Week at the end of April that examined the data implying significant change to the composition of K-3 classrooms in the fall of 21. I'm incredibly excited about today's conversation because we'll be hearing reflections about the very different K-3 classrooms we currently have and those we will experience in the following school year directly from teachers, and then from a panel of leaders connected to thousands of educators across the country. What you'll see today is there will be a significant increase in the proportion of students who have not had a full year of Head Start, PreK, or kindergarten, and for whom everyday attendance is not yet a routine or habit. bringing with them the social emotional effects of isolation from peers potentially. Now, it is true that the landscape over these past 14 months has changed and has provided its set of challenges. But I want to start the conversation today with a sense of hope and optimism, and with an important quote from a leader of the community schools movement, James Comer, that I very much believe in. No significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. And although we're reflecting on data today, which is essential, I want to start the grounding of our conversation in the importance of relationships at all levels of the education system between student and teacher, child and parent, and the evergreen important partnership between parents and teachers. But before we hear from our educator panelists about the opportunities and unique challenges of this upcoming school year, we will together view a recording of the data presentation from the Ed Week session and then have the chance to hear directly from teachers about their reactions to this data and the strategies they're deploying in the classroom. We specifically prompt our speakers to think about the needed relationships and development differences students encounter in this pandemic time, with a focus on the connection between the early years 0 to 5 and K-3. We will also hear from leaders from national teacher advocacy and policy organizations about the supports and professional development they are planning and what they are learning from the networks of thousands of teachers across the country. And now I have the privilege of introducing our incredible panelists. This is a very large panel, so this will be a marathon introduction, but I'll make brief intros and remind everyone that their full bios are posted in the chat and encourage you to download and read more about these phenomenal leaders. So I'll start off with Lyndsey Bonomolo. She is from Los Angeles. She earned her bachelor's in family and consumer sciences. She and her master's in early childhood special education, became a classroom teacher in Los Angeles Unified School District, my home district, making the switch to an instructional support for provider 2 years ago. Lyndsey is a member of Educators for Excellence and has participated in their policy action teams. Courtney Crenshaw is a San Jose State University and Teach for America, New York alumna. She received her MS from Hunter's College, teaches at New Bridges Elementary in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and is in her 8th year as a special education teacher. Priscilla Forsyth is the head of programs for the New York region of Teach for America. She began her career as a 98 TFA Corps member. I'm a TFA Corps member as well, teaching 2nd grade in Compton, California. After 5 years of teaching and leading in Compton, Priscilla attended Cornell Law, where she served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Public Policy and president of the Black Law Students Association before rejoining TFA in 2013. Now on to the next slide. We have Jamita Horton, is a 3rd grade teacher in Southwest Denver, who just got out of the classroom and showed us her wonderful students right before we joined the webinar today. She's not in the class. When she's not in the classroom, she's cooperating with teacher leaders throughout the US to advocate for an equitable childhood education for all students. She's been in education for the past 8 years in a variety of roles that include kinder teacher and grade level chair. She is also a Teach for America alumnus. Treasure Jones is a 3rd grade teacher. Bear with me, we are getting through the marathon of introductions. Treasure Jones is a 3rd grade elementary teacher on the west side of Indianapolis. After many years of mentoring, tutoring, and teaching outside of the classroom, she joined Indianapolis's Legion of Excellent Teachers. She just successfully completed her 1st year of teaching and is in a teaching fellowship. Colleen Mason is a pre-K K1 inclusion teacher at the East Boston Early Ed Center. She has served as the Boston Teachers Union Early Childhood Committee Chair, is on the instructional leadership team and school climate teams at her school. During remote learning, Colleen has worked as a pre-K technology coach for the Boston Public Schools Early Childhood Department. Moving on to the next slide. We have Evan Stone, is the co-founder and co-CEO of Educators for Excellence, a teacher-led organization that seeks to ensure teachers' voices are meaningfully included in policy decisions that impact their classrooms and careers. Evan helps to lead E4E's advocacy, organizing, and growth strategies. Then we have Jessica Tang. She was elected president of the 10,000 member Boston Teachers Union, Local 66 of the American Federation of Teachers in June of 2017. She began teaching middle school social studies in Boston Public Schools in 2005 and served as the first director of organizing in BTU since 2013. Then we have Mark Teoh. He is a senior national director of research and knowledge at Teach Plus, where he leads a national research agenda and partners with teacher leaders to advance state and national initiatives and advocacy. Prior to joining Teach Plus, He served as a district administrator in Boston Public Schools and the Seattle Public Schools and is a former history teacher. And last but not least, only last, because of the alphabetical order of last names, we have the next slide, Dan Weisberg, who is the CEO of the New Teacher Project, TNTP, where he oversees TNTP's executive team in all aspects of the organization's operations, strategy, and growth. Prior to joining TNTP, he served in a variety of leadership roles for the organization, where he supported school systems in states nationwide to recruit, develop, and retain effective teachers and principals. So as you can see, a phenomenal lineup today of folks that are on the ground doing the work with school systems all over the country. And now we're going to watch the clip of the April 27th webinar, co-sponsored with Education Week, that highlights the data implications for the fall 2021 K-3 classroom. After viewing this video, we'll hear from our teachers.
Please tell us how you structured the data that you gathered and what these data imply.
We're going to structure the data around these colors, which reflect how data is depicted within the iReady program. So you'll see, we'll talk about green bars. These green bars indicate these are the kids who are on grade level. They're doing great. Okay. We'll also talk about red bars, and these red bars will indicate percentage of kids who are 2 or more grades below their chronological or current grade level. So these are kids who are pretty far behind and they're really struggling, and they're going to need lots of additional supports to realize success and to track with grade level curriculum. So this data is for reading, and it's grades 1 through 8. And just to orient you to it, please take a look at grade 3. Okay, so what this says is, in the gray bars, historically, 65% of kids were reading at grade level at this point in time in the school year. And this year is dropped to 59%. You see that the drops of the percentage of kids on grade level is certainly more pronounced and most significant in grades 1, 2, and 3. Critical grades, where we're starting by grade 3 to make the shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And we also, I think, all understand the criticality of grade 3. Great organizations like NAEP would tell you lots of sobering statistics about the fact that if you can't read at grade level by grade 3, you're 4 times less likely to graduate from high school. You'll also see in the older grades, there are decreases about the percentage of kids who are on grade level, but they are certainly much, much smaller. But I do want to point out that these decreases of grade level reading expectations and performance for all kids is present in all grades. Now, the flip side of this, unfortunately, is that it's not just that kids are not at grade level. Some of them are very, very far from grade level, and that's depicted by the bars here in red. So if I were to take, for example, 3rd grade, what this says is historically 16% of the kids were multiple grades below their current grade level. And this year it's dropped to 22%. Okay. Now, if I want to understand to what degree these challenges have played out differently for different kinds of populations, I can take a look at this data. And this is specifically for 3rd grade reading. If I take a look at this, what this indicates here is that for schools that serve majority Black populations, okay, the percentage of kids that are on grade level dropped from 47% to 38%. And the percentage of kids who are multiple grades below their current grade level has gone from 27% to 38%. The comparable number for schools that serve majority Latino populations are 8% and 9%. And the comparable numbers for schools that serve majority white populations, 6% and 5%. So this tells you what I don't think anyone's surprised to hear, which is that the implications of the pandemic in terms of school disruptions have disproportionately impacted students of color. I've thrown a lot of data at you really quickly. What's the sum of this? So let's just take an illustration here. Just imagine this is a classroom populated in large part with kids of color, in large part lower income kids. And this is what the world looked like pre-pandemic, if you remember those times, right? In fall of 2019, I have about half my kids are in the yellow chairs, meaning they're a little behind, and if they have a great year, they'll catch up. And I have about the same number of green chairs as red chairs, meaning about the same number of kids who are sort of doing great on grade level as the number of kids who are in red who are going to need additional supports to realize success in the classroom. Okay, that's what it looked like. This is what I think is going to look like in the fall of 2021, a different distribution of those chairs. And specifically, I'm saying we were going in this classroom, we went from 7 kids on grade level to 4. If I think about the red chairs, we went from 7 kids, so we're multiple grades below. grade level to 10. And, 2 of those kids have really not participated in school consistently since the pandemic hit, so for the last year. And 3 of those kids, imagine, will stay virtual. So as a teacher, I have to teach 25 kids in person, simultaneously 3 kids virtually. That's hard. And, all kids will have social emotional needs, but imagine there's a handful that have experienced unique levels of trauma that the teacher may or may not be aware of day one of school. So what's the sum of all this? Why am I telling you this? So the sum of all this, the data, this depiction here, is that, I think we all understand that teaching is more important today than it ever has. But I do want to point out the job is different. It is very different, and it's much harder, right? You think about all those complexities we just talked about that are a result of that data, which are a result of what's going on with COVID and school disruptions. So we support prioritizing the needs of teachers as we think about all the new strategies that we want to employ to support students. We support prioritization of teacher time, teacher needs, and all forms of teacher recognition. Thank you.
Thanks, Woody. Beth, what do the data imply about what teachers need to consider as they plan for their K-3 classes this fall?
Thank you so much for having me. As my colleagues have mentioned, data is crucial as we enter this next academic school year. Among the many ways in which schools are being transformed by the pandemic, changes in public school enrollment will likely have important consequences in elementary classrooms across the nation. Because the academic and non-academic skills students develop in their preschool and early elementary school years are foundational to important long-term outcomes, understanding these changes and finding ways to effectively support our youngest students is critical. Drawing on recent research, we offer 4 timely considerations. Districts across the country reported substantial drops in the number of students enrolled, especially in their kindergartens this past school year. This shift suggests a likely scenario of a kinder bubble in coming years as more and older students enter school. Additionally, districts may see larger split age classes for both first grade and kindergarten cohorts, and with many more students unfamiliar with in-person classroom routines. In some, we need to prepare for greater age differences in kindergarten and in some first grade classrooms. Schools are also seeing sizable declines in preschool enrollment. If these missing students enroll next year, more students will enter formal schooling without typical pre-K preparation. Additionally, as my colleagues have discussed, the pandemic is likely widening inequalities and exacerbating opportunity gaps. Taken together, these trends suggest a wider skill disparity upon entry. Third, we can use summer strategically. Many systems are working to expand their instructional and enrichment programming this summer. Additionally, promising early kindergarten programs bring early childhood and school partners together to promote a successful transition for children and families in underserved communities. Such efforts help children build social skills, acquire the confidence, and become excited about classroom learning. Finally, the academic and non-academic data will play a crucial role in helping educators and families understand the ways to best meet the needs of young students. We also offer some classroom recommendations for educators, including the importance of fostering a sense of belonging and purpose. Elementary teachers are so good at this. Kindergarten teachers in particular play a pivotal role in cultivating students' love of learning, and it all starts with relationships. Taking the time to engage students in getting to know their teacher and their classmates while making space to build learning community is essential in the first few weeks. Second, whole group instruction can be challenging to design when there are a variety of learning needs among students. When you want to provide opportunities to address students' various needs, consider creating small, flexible groups of students. We also stress the need to explicitly teach, model, practice, and monitor classroom routines. This provides students with a predictable and organized learning environment, one in which they feel secure and empowered to self-manage. Finally, I think it's important to acknowledge the heroic efforts educators have made this past year. Teachers have found powerful ways to connect to their students, whether virtually or in person. And those relationships are more critical now than ever as we work to collectively support our youngest students. Thank you for having me.
Hetty, the pandemic is causing greater rates of absenteeism. Tell us what we have to be aware of for this next school year.
Thanks so much for having me here for this really critical conversation. Enrollment hesitancy among families is likely to result in some students, especially from communities hard hit by the pandemic, delaying participation in in-person classrooms. And even more concerning, schools are likely to experience higher levels of chronic absence in the early grades than ever before. Even in a normal school year, it takes a while for families with young students to get used to a new environment, establish a regular routine of showing up to school, and put in place transportation and backup supports so kids can get to class even when families face challenges. And it will be even harder this year when so many students have been out of the routine of in-person school for some as many as 18 months. Prior to the pandemic, 1 out of 10 kindergartners and first graders were chronically absent nationwide. And in low-income communities, this could be double or triple that level. This data from Connecticut offers a picture of what we may see. Chronic absence are almost double. Kindergartners have the highest levels of chronic absence, but what's concerning is those chronic absence levels stay elevated in the remaining elementary grades. Left unaddressed, high rates of chronic absence predict adverse consequences for learning. Chronically absent kindergartners are less likely to read on grade level by 3rd grade, more likely to continue to be chronically absent, more likely to be retained. The gaps grow over time. And students living in poverty suffer the most. They're more likely to experience systemic attendance barriers that are harder to resolve and can last multiple years. And they're less likely to have the resources at home to make up for the lost learning time in the classroom. But the impact isn't just on the individual students who are chronically absent, it's also on their peers, whose math and reading scores can also be affected. Chronic absence is a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. And all of this has implications for how schools and communities can support our youngest students and their families in the coming year. It means that we're going to need to enhance our attention to school climate. We'll need to monitor attendance and chronic absence data so we can better allocate resources for early outreach and intervention and engage in continuous improvement. If kids aren't there, maybe what we're offering isn't working. We're going to have to support positive problem solving, not punitive action. And it's going to make it even more essential that we establish authentic partnerships between teachers, parents, and caregivers. Those who are, quote, the learning guardians for our kids. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the chance to be here.
Well, now in transition from the video, I mean, we know that the information shared mirrors what's been covered throughout the country on the impact of the pandemic on so many students. And as an educator, but also as a mother of a young one, we know that the stakes are high, but we also know that children are resilient. And we want to hear from our educator panelists. If you could please turn your screens on. All right, wonderful. So just as reminders, we have Courtney, Treasure, Lyndsey, Colleen, and Jamita who are joining us today. And for you all to respond, you know, as K-3 teachers over the course of your time teaching, and this is before the pandemic, you've already faced a wide range of academic, developmental readiness, and attendance habits in your classrooms. You've seen the data shared by national partners around what's going on in the preschool years and in the early grades. We want to hear your reactions. Tell us what surprised you about the data, what you expected, and your general reactions. And let's first start with Colleen.
Hi. Having lived this year, I didn't find any of this data shocking at all, especially the literacy data looking at comparing students who went through the pandemic to the students of our past school years. I know students struggled this year. I know that I struggled this year with constantly changing expectations, rules, learning models, and the demands of parenting during COVID. I have a 3-year-old that was doing remote learning with me while his school was closed. So I'm simultaneously parenting and teaching at the same time. I do think what I found the most shocking about the data that we just watched is that it's trying to make determinations about what next year is going to be like without telling the real story of what our students were facing this year. The data was very deficit-based, which is never a great thing to look at when you have students in front of you. Our students were facing homelessness this year. Most of my parents were out of work in East Boston. At one point, the COVID positive rate in East Boston was over 20%, and our families were scared. Our families were sick. My students were sick. More than half of my students themselves had COVID this year. So is their reading data down? Yeah. Was enrollment down as families prioritized their health and safety this year? Yes. Were our families able to make pods with their neighbors and hire a recent education grad to tutor them like the parents in the suburbs? No. So none of the data is surprising, but it's also not my main worry for next year. My main worry is helping students feel welcome back into a classroom that they've been out of for so long, or that felt so unnatural. When we got back, they couldn't share toys, they couldn't play with their friends, they had to wear masks. Everything felt unsafe, even in a welcoming environment. So it's not going to change the high expectations I've always had for students and families. It's not going to change the play or the joy that we have in our classroom or how I support their social emotional learning. I'm actually hopeful that this changes the unhealthy expectations that are being put on our pre-K and kindergarten students, and that play gets to re-enter the kindergarten classroom, and that literacy isn't the only thing we're worrying about anymore, that we're actually going to go back to supporting the whole child and not just reducing them to colors in a data scale and worrying about what their end of the year expectation is going to be. We need to worry about the whole child. And I think the real story that needs to be told is the one that celebrates and focuses on the strengths they've gained this year. They're more independent, they're more verbal, they're better at problem solving, they're more tech literate, they're more resilient. And those are the skills that are going to help the students continue growing. And they have those skills, and they gained them in the pandemic. So 9% down from where they were, fine, not a problem. But if we can channel those skills into culturally relevant project-based work that they're excited about, we can bring play back into the classroom, they're going to catch up. They're going to catch up fine.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you for elevating the importance of play and the resilience and skills, the sort of the silver linings of what has really been gained during the pandemic. I'm going to turn it over to Courtney.
Good afternoon, everyone. When I'm thinking about the reading data and what the researchers presented, it is very clear that there was learning loss this year. That's very clear. The graph showed it, we know it, I know it, being in the classroom remotely this year, the entire year. This is something that the entire nation is facing right now. But when coming from my experience being in the 8th year of my teaching at an NYC in New York City public school in a low income area that has 69% Black students, 23% Latinx students, 23% students with disabilities, and 10% English language learners. This is some data that I similarly see every year. This has not changed. The range of my students has always been a range in my community. When you guys were when they were showing the 7 students above grade level, I might see 1 or 2 students above grade level in my classroom, and seeing more students in the yellow and the red seats. So that's something that's not changing. That's something that I've always had to deal with, and continuing to support my students, not saying like they don't know, but how can I help them? How can we get to where we need to get to by the end of the year? As for next year, I assume my classroom will have an even more wider range of students. That means that there's probably only going to be that 1 student above grade level. And that loss of learning is coming from multiple facets. Like, we're having students coming in from being 100% remote since last March in New York City. We're having students coming in from being hybrid, coming into the building some days, coming into the building and being home for the other days. And then we have students who have been in the building since September and have been there 5 days a week. All we know and all I know is that I'm going to use strength-based and make sure that I can support my students moving forward wherever they are at and reach them where they are at coming in the fall.
Thank you, Courtney. Hearing the continued theme of really focusing in on what strengths the students have this year. And now Jamita from Denver.
Yeah, so for me personally, numbers like that are motivating because my hope is that these numbers mean change. Because I think we're all generally, at least from the two people I heard before me, we're not shocked by the numbers as educators. I think outside sources are the people who are more shocked by this than we are. And so my classroom came back in January from being virtual, and I've seen a lot of things happening in my classroom, but it has really taught me the importance of valuing and giving grace to myself, to kids, to their families. It's taught me about the importance of building and maintaining relationships with families. And it's also taught me that, like, when you have clear scaffolded goals for kids, they can make change even in the midst of this like collective trauma that we're all going through. And so when I think that the pandemic has only solidified my understanding that my communication and relationships with families and parents are so important because they impact attendance. They impact how I understand what's happening on the other side. And then ultimately it gives me a way to collaborate with families in order to give kids what they need. And I hear the term learning loss, and I like to call it learning gaps, because you can't lose something that you don't have, right? They just weren't taught it. And so I think that my job as an educator is like, one, we are in a unique moment where we are in a pandemic and it is affecting us. It's affecting the kids and their families. And you know what teachers are good at? Differentiating and doing what's best for their kids. So I think that there's strengths on both ends that we have to always pull out, because just like any other year, I need to figure out how to meet kids where they are. And the pandemic, sure, it has broadened the gap, but that's something that we're good at, right? Like that's what we're paid to do, is to differentiate and give kids what they need. And I also like to focus on like not just kids being on grade level, but like how much are you growing? Because I think about one of the students who was in my class right now, where he was like severely below grade level at the beginning of the pandemic. But you know what? He is on a second grade reading level now, and that's better than being on a pre-K level. So when you give kids those academic goals and you view it as how can you grow, I think that that's where you're going to see the progress. And kids, when they know their goals and they trust you, then they will continue to make gains.
Absolutely, Jamita. And I echo Stephanie's comment in the chat about really appreciating the positivity. This is 14 months into a mix of potentially in-person, hybrid, fully distance learning. So really appreciate that. Lyndsey, you're up from Los Angeles.
Hi. I'll also echo what everyone's already said, that the data didn't surprise me. I work out of the classroom with teachers who work with children with special needs in early childhood preschool programs. And so one of the things that I think I would like to be concerned about most is that our kids need that structure in that classroom to make progress. It's very important for them. And so the fact that we have a lot of kids that are moving on without having any access at all, because they didn't access due to they didn't have the means to online. And now that we've been back for like a month or so, and they're choosing not to come because, as Colleen mentioned, death and sickness and illness, it's really very scary for their families to send their 3-year-olds with special needs into a program. I worry that all of that work that they would have been able to do for a full year, now they're jumping into kindergarten and they don't have any practice in any of these skills, mostly social emotional. And so I'll also echo about the communication between families, and that our kids did have high absence. We have kids that aren't showing up at all just because it's scary. And so I'm really looking forward to the teachers who I work with who already try their hardest to keep contact with families, but to work even harder because they care and they want to see their kids present, and they want to work from where their children are at and meeting them where they're at to make progress. So that's really what I think is most important from that data.
Yeah, absolutely, Lyndsey. And to close us off, Treasure.
Hi. So yeah, I agree with all of the data. I think that it's extremely important to recognize that although the data, like we may have seen a lot of red students and that's not something that is different from, as Jamita was saying, that's not something that is different from previous years. What I've seen the greatest gaps in is how students are able to interact with each other. And we know that a lot of learning is social. And so it was kind of reintroducing them to each other in a sense, with a mask, with social distancing, learning how to work with manipulatives that are just your own and that you can't share. And another huge gap that I've seen was attendance. And that just took a lot of like reaching out to parents and making sure that they were on your team so that they got those students into the building, and that they understood like these are the measures I'm taking to keep our classroom safe. And then like just consoling them when there is an issue, because my class had to close down for 10 days because there was a lot of like symptoms that were present. So it's a lot of communication, a lot of just affirming the humanity and your parents mostly and your students, and recognizing that this is a very difficult time and that people are scared, and that what people need to do is just talk. So my students needed to talk. I have half my classes split. I have native speakers, native English speakers, and half of my classes EL speakers, or second. They have their home language as a second language, and so it was extremely important to get them communicating and talking. And most of my students were online at the beginning of the year, but because I kept reaching out, because I kept popping up, because I kept showing up on Zoom, now most of my students are in person. So that not only did that help, but just allowing the teacher or the parents to understand that you guys are a partnership, you're a team. And then when the kids get there, embracing them with love and grace, and allowing them to find a new temporary normal, hopefully, and working together with with each other.
Thank you, Treasurer. And we've already started talking a little bit about the strategies that you've all been putting in place for what you think is important moving forward, especially in maintaining positivity with students. And so this moves us into our second question, is our friends, our curriculum associates, put it simply, looking forward to 2021, the job is just different. But we also heard, the job is different and it's also the same from you all. So, and the nation has watched as fundamental aspects of learning have changed during the pandemic. That is from where learning happens to how teaching is done, who is leading instruction, and what are the academic supports for students. So given what we know, now that we're 14 months in, if I'm going to ask this question to two of our teachers, please, share your instructional setting to date, but share with us, what we know about the impact of the pandemic on early learners. How are you planning on changing your practice, or how have you changed it over the course of this year? And we can start with Courtney.
Hi again, everyone. For me, currently, I am teaching remote. I am teaching a class of 22 scholars remote, and I have been remote the whole year with them. Some of my students have left and gone back and forth, but I am still currently remote. But my school does offer 5 days a week to most students who are interested to being returned back into the building. For the fall, it was announced yesterday that New York City schools will be fully in person, so there will be no remote options. So having that in the forefront of what my year is going to look like moving forward, I would say that the biggest thing that I do as an educator to this day and will continue to do is build relationships. Having relationships and building those strong relationships are very key in any classroom. Not only just relationships with your students, but relationships with their families. Building those strong relationships within the classroom, peer-to-peer, is very key. One, because we're talking about instruction loss or the gaps that we're going to be seeing coming in, moving into the fall. If students want to take that leap of faith and that leap to gain in learning, they're going to need to have that trust. And to be able to trust, you're going to need to have those strong relationships for students to make those gains in education. The other thing that I also think is important is social emotional learning. At our school, we use a curriculum called Move This World. And it's something that we do every day. Every day when my students come into the classroom, I ask them, how are you feeling today? We write it in the chat right now, but usually they would move their picture to the part of the mood meter where they are feeling. And we talk about it. Talking about it is very important. Students now have not been in that classroom setting, but even so, it's, you need to talk. They need to talk. They want somebody to hear them. And so instruction, yes, is important, but where is this person? Who can I talk to? Is also important. The last thing that is important is just looking at the data. We know where our students are going to be coming into, or we hopefully at the end of the year will have some type of data, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to just teach to second grade standards, right? I'm going to look into first grade standards. I might even have to look into kindergarten standards depending on where my students range at next year. But those are things that I need to do. I need to differentiate. I heard Jamita mention that earlier. Differentiation is key. Being flexible is key. Those are the two things that I know moving forward we're going to need to have a successful year next year in the classroom.
Thank you, Courtney. And now Colleen.
Courtney, you said so many things I was going to say, but I don't think my role as an early childhood educator probably won't change much. It's always been a pre-K teacher's job to focus on building relationships with students and their families. We've always been the first person to take their babies, and that's always been something we've had to build a really strong relationship with, because it's scary to hand your baby off to a stranger. And we've always focused on the social emotional components of learning and help students learn coping skills. But I think the child entering the classroom has changed. For a lot of the kids entering my class, they were like 12 months old when the pandemic started. They were actual babies. And for a lot of them, the only face they've seen in this entire past 14 months has been their parents, or for some of them, literally just their mom. So a lot of them coming into the classroom, this is going to be their first time really seeing other people, and then also being expected to then build relationships with these strangers that are wearing masks, that they haven't seen, that they've never kind of been outside of their home setting for. So I think for students and their parents, there's going to be a lot of fear next year, which normally there's, the kids who cry on the first day of school because they miss their mom, and after the first week that's over. I do expect that it will last a little bit longer. And so there's going to be a lot more need to kind of fix that collaborative culture in our classrooms, that collaborative culture of learning, because even my students who return, so in Boston, we do mixed age group pre-K. So I'll have 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, which means half my students will loop with me again next year and be in my class. But they've spent the past 3 months that we've been back in person isolated even within our classroom because of those social distancing regulations. So it's turned pre-K on its head. We're normally like a collectivist culture where we're all growing and thriving together and celebrating each other's wins and gains, to this very like individualistic, like, well, I can only worry about my toys and my materials, and I can show the kids 6 feet away what I made, but like they don't really care because they're 6 feet away and we don't have the same relationship we normally have. So I think the main thing will be getting us back to a place where students see each other as a source of joy and see each other as role models and see each other as places where they can learn and have fun together. This year hasn't been fun. It's been a lot of things. There's been positive things, but it hasn't been fun the way it normally is. And so I look forward to being able to get back to joy.
And Colleen, that speaks to me a lot as a mother of a 3.5-year-old who will be handing off my baby who has been home and, tried our best to make sure that they are still interacting with others, but in limited ways. So fun is definitely something I'm looking forward to for my child. But now actually that's a perfect segue into this next question, which is, pre-K teachers have typically had a lot of training and exposure on social emotional development. What are the non-academic and some academic cues of how children develop? And K-3 teachers may have less of this in their formal training, right? So given the dip in preschool enrollment and even in kindergarten, this means K-3 teachers will just be faced with a bigger lift, which we've already talked about in addressing developmental needs, school readiness, and fundamental things like sharing and a culture of collectivism and being in spaces with others. So what are your thoughts on providing more social emotional development milestone trainings and support for K-3 teachers? Is it necessary? How essential is it for recovery from these past 14 months? And I'm going to start off with Jamita, and I'm going to give us 1 minute for this question because then we'll transition to the next portion of this panel.
Hey y'all. Yeah, it's so necessary. Like, it's necessary for me as an educator to understand students and where they're coming from. And it's also necessary for me to be able to react in a way that's going to be beneficial to the child and less harmful for whatever the child is going through. And I think, so my school is actually unique where we do have sacred time where teachers have professional development in social emotional issues from K through 5th grade. And we also have sacred time on the table where every day there's time where we actually focus on that. And I think that that's a big gap, is creating the time and the space for those things to happen in meaningful ways. And through my SEL training, I've been able to explore my identity, my biases, my triggers, and things like that. And once I'm able to see that in myself, it's helped me do the same thing with kids, because I can't help a kid if I don't know how to go through that process myself. So that's where I've seen the importance of it now, especially with all the things that are going on from the pandemic to the social justice movements. Like, it's so important that we're able to have confidence in who we are and understand who we are in our backgrounds, and for kids to have that as well.
Thank you, Jamita. Now, Lyndsey.
Yeah, I also agree. It's very necessary. As a preschool teacher, we already discussed, we do teach this explicitly to our students, especially students with IEPs. And so I think that that's really important for teachers to have access to professional development so that they can learn how to teach this, just like they might teach a math class or a literacy activity. It needs to be taught explicitly. And I also wanted to share that we use something called Sesame Street in Communities that's accessible to families, that offers a range of different materials to support social emotional learning. And we found that our teachers really appreciated those materials as well, because they could bring those strategies back to the classrooms for their students. And I did also lastly just want to share that because the students that I serve all have IEPs, the anecdotal data follows them to their next teacher without a miss. They get to the next teacher because they're going to be moving on with that document. And in our school district and the students that we serve, a lot of the students may be unhoused, they may be moving constantly during the school year, going to multiple schools per year. And then those teachers don't receive the data from the previous teacher. So I think that this is an area that I believe could be addressed to ensure that all teachers can provide their students with great instruction from the first day. And that would also go for social emotional learning too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lyndsey, for raising up, right? We can, following the quantitative data on numbers for students is one thing, but being able to really look at the depth of information from their last teacher on what's worked, what has been tried, what are supports, what is the real reality for that student, that's absolutely key. And now Treasure, you'll close us out for the teacher panel.
Thank you. Yes, Lyndsey, I absolutely love that. Just creating like, not a profile, but essentially a profile on a student so that we can have tips and tricks for that student next year or the following year. But going back to the question explicitly, yes, it is super, super necessary. And I think it will be crucial for recovery from the last 14 months of school. And we already know that if a student is in flight, fight, freeze, or fawn, they're not learning, right? And this year and all of the traumatic things that have happened because of the virus and those things, it's not, I don't think it's okay to discount the fact that that student may be in that mindset. Additionally, we know that students, when you have like plants in your classroom or things that life in your classroom, when you have natural lighting, these things help the brain and allow the students to focus just on learning instead of whether or not they're like breathing stale air, or the lights that are fake, and the UVs and all those things. And so it's like socio-emotional learning and learning how the brain impacts learning or child development in regards to the brain is extremely important for the teacher to understand. And it'll create like a unanimous type of culture for all the teachers so that they're doing similar things to create a comfortable learning environment for their students. And so that when one student is in my classroom, it's not drastically different. The culture is different, of course, but it's not drastically different. They're still getting the same things that they need from my classroom and beyond. Additionally, I think because with so much learning loss and in general, just filling in those gaps, a student has to be able to be authentic in our classroom. And that authenticity and us being able to connect to that and us being able to celebrate that in our classroom, first learning how to do that and then learning how to implement that and learning that we come in the classroom with biases too. Our students come in the classroom with biases, and just learning how to navigate all of those things will create an environment that where rigor can stand.
Thank you, Treasurer, and I echo Joe's sentiments in the chat. You're all fantastic, and thank you so much for joining us. Please post any questions you have for teachers in the chat now. We'll come back to them at the Q&A session, but it'll be great. Just queue them up. So please go ahead and add your questions for teachers in the chat. They're going to go off camera, but will still be with us through the Q&A. And now we're going to have folks from teacher leader organizations join us. And so to start off, if we can turn all of our cameras on our second panel front. So Priscilla, Jessica, thank you, Evan, Mark, and Dan. So same question teachers started off with. What are your reflections? But also feel free to jump in and weigh in on what teachers shared as well. And we're going to go ahead and get started with Jessica.
Thanks. So good to be here with everyone. And, everything that the teachers are saying definitely resonated because I absolutely take my cue from our early educators and being able to represent our educators in my role. And so I think just like everybody else, we're absolutely not surprised by the data. And it wouldn't make any sense otherwise. And we know that the pandemic disproportionately impacted communities of color. So it's not surprising at all that it has impacted their learning. And I agree with Colleen 100% that I do think that what we're looking at is very deficit oriented. And what's missing from the data is what students have learned. What skills can we continue to help them build that they honestly may not have had otherwise. In fact, I've visited a bunch of virtual classrooms and I'm just so impressed, actually. I know second graders and first graders who can manage Zoom much better than so many adults that I'm also on many meetings with, for example. Their tech skills, I think, are far above where they would normally be without their experience. But I think that instead of just looking at the data, that's looking at the student outcomes that we all could have predicted, I think that we need to also focus on the data of what the inputs are. So in other words, how did we get here? And, when we look at that data, you have, it's kind of like, oh, what are the students missing? Or, what are the parents or families not doing? But in reality, I think we need to be looking at what got us here in the first place, and what were the inputs even pre-pandemic, where we already had a lot of these existing gaps. And also not just looking at what the teachers need to do or consider, but what in fact are the teaching and learning conditions. So for example, I know that in Massachusetts, if we're thinking about the students who benefited more from in-person learning for longer periods of time during the pandemic and then not, a lot of our urban school districts took longer to get back in person, even for hybrid. And it was not because teachers didn't want to be back in schools with their students. I promise you, every single teacher, wanted to be back in the classroom because that's how they know how to teach, is with students. There was a huge learning curve for the virtual learning. But why was it that some of the Catholic and private schools in suburban and wealthier districts could go back earlier? Well, I think that we have to look at, what were the pre-existing conditions before the pandemic? Our facilities in urban public schools that predominantly serve our Black and Brown and Asian students, they were suffering from decades of deferred maintenance already. And so in order to get our buildings safe for students and educators to come back, we had to do so much more. We couldn't just, work with one school too. We were talking about, over 125 buildings in Boston, for example. 2/3 of them were built before World War II. Only 35 of them even had HVAC. And of those 35, not all of them could even use or put in the MERV 13 filters, which were the recommended ones from the CDC. And we didn't have green spaces where we could just open up outdoor classrooms. And so, as teachers unions, we had to fight so hard just to get the conditions that our students should have had in first place, to have well-ventilated classrooms and have adequate PPE. We had to fight for our air inspections where they found faulty vent engines and dampers that weren't properly placed. And so because of our advocacy, our students were able to get back into our schools, but they weren't able to get back in as quickly as others because of the pre-existing conditions that our students were already facing. And there are also, I think, when we're looking at the data, a lot of pieces that weren't in place pre-pandemic already anyway. And that's access, for example, to reading intervention, reading specialists. That's something we've long advocated for, are going to continue to advocate for, especially with our upcoming contract negotiations. We're talking about also the size of class sizes. And so a lot of the other private parochial suburban schools have smaller class sizes. And when our students have oftentimes greater obstacles to overcome, again, being disproportionately impacted by COVID and family members getting sick, dying, there's a lot of trauma. We need more. And so I'm starting to get into some of the solutions, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later in the panel. So I'll stop there. But I think that as we continue to look at the data, we cannot forget about the assets. And so I know that someone had said, some of the families didn't have the resources at home to help fill the gaps. Well, then let's not just give up there. Families are resources themselves. So what is it that they need? We need to be focusing on what is it that they have already that we can build upon. And if we're not looking at the assets of our educators and students and parents and looking at the data of what they have been able to do, then I think we're missing opportunities to build on that when we move forward as well and try to address these inequities that already existed pre-pandemic.
Thank you, Jessica. And on the inputs and strategies front, we will be talking about what are some of the most important investments as we see sort of an unprecedented investment in schools. But I'm going to kick it over to Dan to keep us going on the sort of first response to the data.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeimee, and really appreciate being invited to be on this panel with so many great educators. One of the things that strikes me looking at the data, like everybody else, it's not surprising to see the data about the effects of the disruption on student learning. It's not surprising to see the effects on attendance and on enrollment for all the reasons that folks have pointed out. But what is also clear in listening to Treasurer and Courtney and the other great educators on the call is we have a tremendous opportunity now this year and in the coming years to right a wrong. And if we're really honest, in spite of the incredible efforts of teachers like the ones on this panel individually, as a country, we do an incredibly poor job of helping kids to catch up socially, emotionally, and academically. We just don't have a good record when kids are behind of helping them to get back to the point where they can reach their goals in school and in life. But we do have an opportunity now because there is tremendous focus. There's always been focus among educators and teachers on this problem. But now there's focus really among the whole country and a lot of the people who pull the levers of power on this really critical issue. And there's, maybe once in a generation infusion of federal funds. So as I'm looking at the data, listening to my colleagues, what I'm thinking about is what an opportunity to do the sorts of things that we're going to talk about in a minute and that the panelists already talk about to change the way we approach this. Because one thing we can probably all agree on, although we probably disagree some on what are the right pathways to help our kids and our families right now, we probably all agree that doing things the same way we did them pre-pandemic is just going to lead to further inequities based on race, based on income, based on a host of other factors that in the past have caused kids and families to be marginalized by our system. So what I'm really excited about in forums like this is to talk about what should we really do different, and how can we support our teachers who are doing the hard work in classrooms every day so that they can do things differently, so that what we're hearing from all of us is kids aren't the problem. Yes, kids are definitely this year more than ever coming to school with pain and loss and trauma in some cases, but these are not new challenges. The challenges are different in magnitude. When you look at the data, they're not different in nature. We've been dealing with these sorts of challenges for a long, long time. So if we can support our teachers, if we can be open, if we can connect and continue to build relationship with families and with students, and if we can be open to doing things differently, I think we can finally right a wrong that's existed and create a tremendous inequity for decades and decades.
Thank you, Dan. And now Priscilla.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, everything I've said has been said. So I'll try to, shorten it a bit. But one, just I appreciated, like, it's not surprising data, of course, it's deeply concerning nonetheless. And I will just add that I appreciate the illustrated visual. I always find that really, really helpful and sort of emotionally impactful. But like Courtney and everyone else is saying, and Dan, you said it so well before, like, this is a pre-COVID problem that is only magnified as a result of COVID, and the stark educational inequities that existed, particularly, I work in New York City, so of course that's my focus, but were such that the pre-COVID classrooms looked much like the post-COVID model that was shown in the data. And many of our teachers, as we heard from the teachers on this panel, have really done everything they can for years now to try to address those gaps and support our students to make well beyond a typical year's worth of growth every year. And so in that sense, this year won't be dramatically different. And to kind of get at some of what Dan was saying about, like, what will we do differently in this moment, I will say that I hear a lot from our teachers and school partners right now about this sense that even as we are talking more about social emotional learning, that there still is this perception that there's a strong pressure to prioritize academic outcomes over the social emotional mental health and wellness needs of our school communities. And so, like, I think a great example would be sort of what happened with state testing this year, and sort of how long it took for certain decisions to be made to lead schools to feel like they could prioritize other things and not have to do these tests in light of everything that was going on. I think that's one example I've heard from our community. And I just want to add that I think something that hasn't yet been brought up, but I think is just so important to just name, is that how these social emotional and sort of wellness and mental health needs are particularly acute, not just because of COVID, but with the added layer of trauma from the ongoing pandemic of systemic racism that has been brought into unprecedented light this past year. And so right now, those needs are feeling really important at every level. I heard this from teachers too. It's students and families, of course, but it's also our teachers and our school leaders who are dealing with the same grief and trauma and loss and challenges that we need to make sure our school communities and our school systems are able to support and create these communities of healing. So yeah, I do think the opportunity here is to do what I think has felt scary in the past, is to really prioritize, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like social, emotional well-being and wellness, in pursuit of closing and focusing on academic gains. It's not that there's an either or, but I do think sometimes that pressure to focus just on the academics has actually undermined the needs to focus on safety and wellness, et cetera.
Absolutely, Priscilla. What does it look like to say both and, right? Like, let's not pit them against one another, but provide educators the opportunity and space and resources to do both. And now Evan, and then Mark to close us off in this first question. We'll move on to thinking about strategies and inputs moving forward.
Great. It's wonderful to be on this panel with so many awesome educators and advocates. My name is Evan Stone. I'm with Educators for Excellence. Like everybody else, I don't think this data is surprising, and it shouldn't be given how learning was disrupted. And there's actually some other research that's out there. One paper I recently read from PACE, which is a group of universities in California, actually broke down the sort of arc of how learning was interrupted, particularly for early reading fluency. And I'll put it in the chat for people. And it shows us that last spring was the most disrupted. We were thrown into chaos. Nobody was prepared for that. We couldn't have been prepared for that. But then actually in the fall and into the winter, we saw learning start to recover in some cases. Didn't make up for the gaps that we saw that happened. But what that's telling me is that educators are nimble, they can innovate, and they were finding new techniques and strategies that were working, some of which we heard from. So I do think there's a lot that we can take from our learnings and apply to the system. To Dan's point, that we're not going back to a system that we know was failing far too many kids, particularly Black and Brown students and English language learners and low income students and special ed students before the system, before the disruption that we had. And so we weren't prepared for the spring last year, but we need to be prepared for the fall this time. And so with this massive investment that is coming out to states and to districts, frankly, at this point, I am not seeing lots of innovation, lots of bold ideas, lots of transformative investments on how these dollars are going to be used. And so I heard more of those bold, exciting, innovative ideas from the educators just before this. And so we're thinking a lot about how do we connect amazing educators like these to policymakers so that they don't just stumble back into a system that we know wasn't doing enough for kids before the pandemic. And then to Priscilla's point, I just want to hit this home because I think it is so true. Like for too long, we have separated academic learning and social emotional development as though they are different, when we know great teaching is social emotional learning. Rigorous teaching is social emotional development. There's a connection between the two and they are inextricably linked. And we are hearing from teachers across the country that they want to see investments to support that development. So the data is not surprising, but we should dig deeper to see where there was learning and innovation that we don't want to lose sight of, so that we don't go back to a system that we know was failing far too many students before the pandemic.
Thank you, Evan and Mark.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me this afternoon. I wanted just to reinforce the data point that likely resonates with many of the teachers we've been listening to over the past year, and that has to do with absenteeism and student engagement. As Courtney shared earlier, teachers are quick to point out the value and importance of fostering strong relationships with their students. And we know that when a student feels seen and heard by the educators and staff in a building, they're more likely to thrive. What this attendance data points to is that for many children, their families and the educators who work with them, we've experienced a very different year when it comes to the important work of relationship building. So perhaps we need to think about how to strengthen or adjust our approaches to relationship building. One teacher-led recommendation that emerged from hundreds of focus group interviews that Teach+ teacher leaders conducted last year points to the need for helping teachers incorporate social and emotional learning skills into their instructional practice, points that are underscored by today's teacher panel. So I'm hopeful that we are observing a shift of SEL from being considered a nice to have in schools to a need to have. Pre-pandemic, teachers often reported that they were not receiving enough SEL related support in their pre-service training or in their in-service professional development. So over the past year, we have seen how teachers have eagerly sought out opportunities to learn from their peers and other experts to further their own understanding of social emotional learning skills and approaches. So looking ahead to the next school year, one path forward towards improving in student engagement and learning can be through authentically addressing the SEL needs of students. Teachers have been recommending that this needs to be addressed in partnership with teacher preparation programs, as well as through district and school professional development, and that schools leverage the expertise of the teacher leaders who are already doing this well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And now we're actually going to move into some of the strategies that are necessary for recovering from this moment, or just reimagining what schools are looking like moving forward. And I actually want to package a couple of questions from our attendees that are actually very, very connected to this. So the broader question is, what changes in school practice or policies will be essential to address the widening gaps we're seeing? What are the implications for the entire K-12 system of these challenges in the early grades? But I also want to add in the question from Lori in the chat around, helping decision makers to understand the necessary inputs in this moment. Our panelists have already spoken to this a bit. How do we bring the folks that are making decisions about the tremendous expenditures of ARP dollars into these conversations around innovation? And also a question from Amy around, what's the role of assessment in that? Because it is a key leverage and communication point between decision makers and what goes on in schools. And so I will start with Priscilla. Priscilla, Mark, and Dan are answering this question. Go ahead, Priscilla.
Ooh, the question got really rich.
Sorry.
That's fine. I mean, I think, at least in terms of my work at Teach for America, what I'm obsessing over on a daily basis is how we are training and preparing to support new teachers in particular to deliver for our most vulnerable students. And now in the context of COVID, et cetera, it's quite an interesting undertaking. But I think, again, because so many of the pre-COVID conditions are just really the same, just bigger now, we are really doubling down on the things that we have already found we know work and are important. So our program is really centered around developing anti-racist, culturally responsive, trauma-informed teachers with an understanding of learner variability and universal design for learning. And I think something that's sort of new this year is a real focus on the science of reading, and that is for our early learning, our early childhood teachers, but it's also for all of our teachers, as we know that literacy is important, through K-12, and that there are gaps to address throughout the whole continuum. And we're finding that this is really the right stuff and that we need to go deeper. And so I think in terms of the how, which I think there are some connections that could be made to how some of these dollars could be spent. I mean, I do think for us, it's really important to double down on the coaching support that we are providing teachers, particularly in that transition period for a new teacher, the first 90 days on the job. And so in order to do that, we've had to decrease our cohort sizes, hire more coaches. I think also we're trying to leverage more virtual observations, even as we return to in-person, but just to kind of decrease the amount of time folks are spending, traveling around to schools, et cetera, but really getting straight to the crux of things, and to including more consistent and frequent touch points with teachers, increased collaboration between all the players who support our teachers. So that's the admin at schools, it's our coaches, but it's also the graduate school faculty who support our teachers. We just have learned that when we are all coordinated and working together, there's so much we can wrap our arms around our new teachers and support them to achieve so much more. We've also are focusing a lot on building community for our teachers and among our teachers so that they can have live learning spaces and processing spaces to build resilience with one another, and to have that crucial peer support through the challenges that they're facing. Our teachers consistently say they learn the most from peers, and so I do think there's a lot more around collaborative learning for teachers in general, and that's something we're focused a lot on. And then just lastly, I would just say, we are really trying to dramatically increase the extent to which we center teacher wellness in all of our work, and also wellness and social emotional learning in all of the sort of student curriculum and work that we focus on with our teachers. There really is just no way that we're going to get through this unless we are thinking about teacher wellness and sustainability. They are so critical to the short and the long term of this work.
Thank you, Priscilla. Now, Mark and Dan, and I know we're jumping into the Q&A here. We're going to do a mix of Q&A as we answer these last questions and bring our educators back. Go for it, Mark.
Sure. One of the things that was encouraging that we saw during the pandemic was that so many districts were taking the pulse of their teachers and taking their input into consideration as they're planning for how to address the needs of their kids and their schools. But while nice, this shouldn't be enough. Many teachers are asking for more distributed leadership in their schools where they can be authentically involved in the decision-making processes that go on. This could mean things like district planning committees or being part of advisory cabinets established by district and state leaders. We also think that this could take the place in the form of teacher leadership with real roles and responsibilities in changing schools and districts. Imagine the impact having teachers like the ones we're hearing from today directly influencing school and district decision-making. That's lacking in far too many places. And as Priscilla mentioned, a particularly promising practice that has emerged during this pandemic has been teacher-led professional learning opportunities and communities. These can be powerful and capacity building levers for schools and districts as they think about the summer and the coming school year. Thank you.
Dan?
Hey, thanks, Jeimee. Well, the critical point about elevating the voices of teachers in decision-making and policy-making, I'm gonna leave that to Mark and Jessica and Evan. I would just say, for you teachers out there, it is part of the federal law that is dispersing all this money that districts and states must engage with teachers, with parents, with community members. So to the extent you're feeling shut out, talk to some of these great organizations represented here, because really that means that your school or school system is not following the law. So hopefully we'll see an explosion in engagement with teachers, but also with parents and families and students. I'll be brief because I know Jeimee will run out of time. A couple of things. I mean, just two. Treasure talked about the fact that kids can't learn if they're in fight or flight syndrome. Absolutely right. And great teachers, of course, figure out ways, often really creative ways, to check in on each of their students pretty much every day. But that's hard and time consuming. You can't always do it when you're conducting lessons. One of the things we've done and helped to put out in the field is pulse surveys that teachers can give all of their kids, including, by the way, down to pre-K. We make it really, really simple, where the kids just do two things. They answer the question, how are you experiencing, essentially, school this week? Are you feeling okay? Are you really, really having a good time? Are you having kind of a good time? On the other side, are you having a really bad time? And then just an option for them to put in whatever they're feeling. And what we've seen, what we heard from the teachers we work with on this, is that different type of, call it diagnostic, it's not, that's really too fancy a word, is providing them with additional information about how their kiddos are doing. And particularly identifying students who might need extra help, might really need a home visit, might really need a conference or something. So that's something, hey, we're all a little bit more comfortable with technology. That's something that we can actually do, and it can be done really cheaply and really easily without making teachers' lives harder. Actually can make teachers' lives a lot easier. By the way, that same pulse survey that we're helping with is to parents and to teachers as well. So really, really helpful. And then the other is, yeah, how do we catch kids up? And so, we in the chat earlier, we put a paper that we came out with yesterday with our friends from Zern, elementary math curriculum provider, about learning acceleration. And what happens with traditional remediation, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, students have missed a third of the prior grade, let's just repeat that. Or I think that the student is struggling with all of these standards from the prior grade, let's repeat all of those. But in practice, what happens, just to be really blunt, is it just exacerbates racial inequities and other types of inequities. And one of the things we see in the study, if you take a look at it, is which kids are getting that review after review after remediation in a disproportionate way. Kids of color, kids from low-income families, kids with special needs, kids who are learning English. This is what's happening. And what happens in practice is they never catch up. So figuring out, including definitely K-3, how do we provide all kids access to grade level work and assignments and texts and math problems? And then where they need help, give them just-in-time help. And by the way, we should not leave this to individual teachers to figure out themselves. This is really tough. Some curriculum providers do a really good job of this. Some PD providers do a really good job of this. But what it means, just to give a really quick practical example, if you are working on the giving tree in first or second grade, and you're worried that some kids are going to have trouble decoding with that level of text, that doesn't mean that you don't read it out loud instead of reading something that's a lower level text out loud, because that's going to help with listening comprehension. And then give extra time for the kids to work through the decoding that they may have trouble with, and extra help there. So those are the two things: being much more systematic about checking in with our kiddos and student engagement, and then really giving our teachers the help they need in order to accelerate kids up to grade level so they can be on track to reach their goals.
Thank you, Dan. And I know we've blended our Q&A session here with our final panelist comments. We have one more question, but I want to invite teachers to turn their cameras back on, and also attendees to continue to add questions. We've already answered a few. We have 2 open ones left. So this is the time so we can plan to make sure that we answer those questions to get them to you. But I want to turn it over, thinking about the longer term systems change that's needed, right? We've talked about we can't go back to the way things were. We've learned a lot from the pandemic. And so how do we think about that moving forward? What are the most significant places to create infusions of state funds and ARP dollars to address the growing challenges? And I'm gonna have Evan and Jessica close that out. And then we're gonna open it up for the formal Q&A, and make sure that there's also a poll that just prompted in front of you that you can start to fill out. But go for it, Evan.
So in the winter, E3 conducted a national survey of a little over 800 teachers. And then over the last 5 weeks, we've made 30,000 phone calls to teachers to ask them these types of questions. And I've had a little more than 3,000 conversations with educators. And we ask these questions because, remember, 95% of these federal dollars are going straight to districts with very little guidance, very little restrictions on how those dollars could be used. And so it's really important that teachers are talking to their district, engaging with organizations, engaging with their union, making it really clear what their school and their students need. And we've heard sort of 5 key areas that I will quickly try to summarize. One comes from that data, like chronic absenteeism is a problem, and teachers are saying we need to connect with our families. We need to invite them back into our schools. We need to make them feel welcome to come back. We need to answer their questions. And so teachers want districts to be investing in a real plan to make sure they're reconnecting with families, particularly students that have been missing the most school, but all kids, so that they want to come back into the buildings, their questions are answered, and their anxieties where possible are addressed. The second thing we're hearing a ton of, especially for the early grades, but this is true for all students, is this focus on social emotional development, the socialization, the routines, the joy that school was for kids, the extracurricular activities. I think Jamita and Lyndsey both spoke to the benefits of investing in SEL training for educators. So teachers are telling us we need to invest in training for teachers. We need to support additional headcount in our schools with trained professionals to help with social emotional challenges and trauma. This by far is the highest priority that we've heard from teachers across the country, because they know their kids in many cases are hurting and looking for help and support, and they're going to come back to school needing that. The third thing is that teachers are telling us that we really need to assess students' needs and invest in better tools. And they don't just mean assess in terms of diagnostic tests to determine where kids are. They also mean investing in assessing physical and mental and health needs of kids. For example, in New York, we have a group of teachers calling for mandatory dyslexia screenings because they know 1 in 10 kids are likely to have some neurodiversity like dyslexia. And we need to target and figure that out early so we can address it. But it also means really high quality, culturally relevant, rigorous curriculum. It is like far beyond time that we're not asking every teacher to reinvent the wheel, and that they have great curriculum that represents the identities of their students, that they can differentiate and tweak and make their own, but that they're not starting from scratch. They're telling us high quality tutoring, using grade level material that's aligned to their classroom curriculum. This for us has 2 great benefits. One, it brings lots of trained partners into buildings that creates hopefully a really diverse pathway for teachers into the profession, but it also gets additional adults in front of kids to help support their growth. And then finally, equitable budgets. Like right now, this massive infusion of federal resources, and hopefully that'll be followed with an increase in Title I dollars, should be used to pressure and incentivize states and districts to make their funding formulas more equitable, to send more dollars to our highest need students, to our low-income students and students with disabilities and English language learners, that disproportionately are getting far fewer resources than their suburban and wealthier and whiter peers. So those are what we're hearing. They are clear, they are consistent. And so for us, it's about how do we make sure policymakers are hearing these things from educators and actually implementing real plans and real change.
Thank you, Evan. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, but Jessica, especially given your advocacy and expertise around SEL, social emotional issues, many of the questions in the chat are actually about this, right? How do we get to the granular level and the types of investments that are necessary to really move the needle on the types of supports both educators and students and parents need on the social emotional front?
I couldn't have planted that question better myself, because the first thing I was actually going to say was that, the solutions can't just be focused on the individual teacher responses. They have to be focused on the assets of our students, educators, and parents and families as well. And specifically, when we talk about SEL well for students, I completely agree with Priscilla's point that we have to talk about the SEL well for our educators and our families as well. They all go hand in hand. And so certainly, we are advocating for a guidance counselor, social workers, school psychologists. We don't have one in each one of our schools. And the need has never been greater. We were advocating for this before the pandemic, and certainly now that need is greater. I've been advocating for a long time, actually, for the district to implement the Yale Child Study programs. Dr. Mark Brackett has this whole, program, you could say, on SEL well, and this book called Permission to Feel. And he basically says, one of the major mistakes districts make is they go right to the students and completely ignore the SEL well skills of the adults. And he's like, actually, you got to start with the adults. And that includes the leadership from the top down to the superintendents, to the school leaders and the educators, or you're actually missing a lot in terms of implementation. And SEL well, there's plenty of curriculum. I know that in BPS, for example, we have Open Circle, Second Step, et cetera. But the SEL well is so important to focus on because that's how we learn about our families. I just learned the other day about a teacher who was doing these 10-15-minute SEL well check-ins in the morning, and there was a student who usually does really well but had kind of dropped off. And when he came back one day, he finally talked about how he had been gone because they're afraid because his father might be deported. And so then we were able to learn about that and take action and help support the family. But without that SEL well block of time, that teacher may not have learned that was the reason he wasn't showing up to school, right? And so I could spend a lot of time on SEL well for sure, but we've also surveyed our members and asked how we should use these funds and what should the priorities be. So I'll just share a few of the other ones too. Another one of the priorities besides SEL well is definitely facilities, safe and healthy schools. That has been, I think, a number one reason why a lot of families have chosen not to come back in person is because if the facilities weren't great before, there was little trust that the facilities are safe and healthy now. And so there's a lot of work to do to improve our facilities and also rebuild the trust. Summer school, of course, bridging the spring and fall formal education so that it's not a one-off, but really there's more continuity. How do we help get resources at home? Again, if students don't have that stable family situation, are worried about food insecurity, housing insecurity, then we are missing a piece of how to support our students and families. Absolutely thinking about reading interventions, reading specialists. We have a lot of teachers actually who want to learn about Orton Gillingham or Wilson, but in the past have said, the district said it's too expensive to train everyone or send them to professional development. Well, there's no excuse for that now. There's got to be investments into helping educators get the PD that they need. Class size is a huge one too. Supports for special education EL students. And I'll wrap up by saying too that culturally relevant curriculum matters so much. We've heard a lot about also recruiting, retaining educators of color. interpretation and translation is key to being able to connect with a lot of our families. And at the early grade levels, again, those family partnerships and relationships are so important. We also know that if we don't address anti-racism at an early age, then it's a lost opportunity. It can and should be addressed at an early age. And in Boston, at least, our Asian American families are actually least likely to come back. And as we delve a little deeper, a lot of it's fear of bullying in schools right now. And so we absolutely have to address anti-racism. And lastly, I'll just say, when I look at the data and the way that it's framed, sometimes there is this, I think, reaction to, okay, we got to like focus on the academics. But for early education, what I hear over and over from early educators is that focus on the standards and the on grade level learning and academics and scope and sequence, it cannot come at the expense of play. And the learning social skills, the problem solving through play, and also inspiring the joy of learning that oftentimes is lost, especially when we get to the third grade levels. So anyway, I'll wrap up there because I know we're running low on time, but I'll just say we cannot leave it up to educators to just figure it out. Educators were left to figure it out for over 1.5 years now. And that is not a way to address the gaps that our students are facing at a systemic level. So we have to have systemic solutions. And we need to ensure that our districts are actually listening, not just checking off a box and saying, check, I talked to teachers, but actually listening and showing that they're implementing what they hear and in the ways they use the resources and change the way we are actually creating the schools our students deserve in a meaningful way.
Absolutely, Jessica. And just want to note that, over 100 people have stuck with us right to the end of the hour here. So much gratitude for you all for spending all of this time together. We will round up all of these resources and send them out with our post in our post summary. So we'll definitely get any more on professional development. Thank you all so much to the presenters for joining, teachers jumping right out of the classroom or maybe in the classroom to do some of this work, this heavy lift on sharing what are the practices that we need moving forward to not replicate the same challenges we've seen before. And I just want to remind you of the upcoming GLR Tuesday sessions. You can see them listed here, and please do take the poll. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It was such a rich conversation. Take care, everyone.